Chapter 1. The Fall Before the Fire. The great halls of Aurelia were not built for mercy. They were constructed from obsidian and pride, a vast monolithic fortress clinging to the side of Mount Elshar, like a thorn made of stone and status. It was here, beneath the spires that clawed at the twin suns, that the nobles of the Crystari Dominion gathered for judgment, not as impartial arbiters, but as devourers of dignity. Highborns adorned in shimmering plasma-threaded robes reclined on platforms carved from floating crystal, their eyes glimmering with detached amusement as a girl was dragged to the center dais, her chain scraping against the polished floor with each reluctant step. She was young, barely into her maturity cycle, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion, her silver-white skin blotched with bruises that pulsed faintly with the phosphorescence of her kind, bruises inflicted not by enemy blades, but by her own bloodline. Her name was Elira Vel, first and only daughter of the disgraced House Velker, once a noble house of distinction, now reduced to a cautionary tale whispered in political halls and spit upon by diplomats who once begged for their favor. The noble audience did not regard her as a person. They saw a symbol, a ruin, a casualty of ambition burned too brightly. House Velker had dared challenge the dominance of House Dresha, and for a time, they had almost succeeded, with Elira's mother claiming technological breakthroughs in graviton manipulation that could have shifted the power structures of the entire Dominion. But House Dresha, ever a serpent coiled in the shadows, had struck without mercy, using the weight of political alliances to destroy the Velker legacy. The resulting downfall was brutal torture, betrayal, exile. Elira Vel, a child once bathed in the light of progress, had watched her family's house burn to the ground, each flame carrying away a piece of her soul. Now, she was but a plaything to the same court that once admired her mother. The Crystari nobles, gathered in their shimmering finery, chuckled as she stumbled. There was no compassion, no empathy, only the gleaming eyes of those who had come to witness her fall, knowing that they were both the perpetrators and the audience. Elira's wrists were bound by heavy metallic chains, the links so tightly interwoven that no strength of her own could ever hope to break free. She had been dragged through the courts like cattle to the slaughter, subjected to the cruel whims of those who had long ago sold their souls for power, who viewed any act of kindness as a weakness to be exploited. Her hands trembled as she was forced to kneel before the dais where the high lords and ladies of the Crystari Dominion waited with their gazes fixed firmly upon her. Livia Tresh, the cruel matron of House Dresha, smiled coldly, her lips curling in a silent sneer. She had orchestrated the fall of House Velker, and now she reveled in the quiet destruction of a once proud family. Beside her, her son, the young Lord Tyros Tresh, whispered something into her ear, and she let out a laugh that reverberated through the hall. The sound was rich with malice, as though every moment of Elira's humiliation was a symphony to her ears. "How tragic," Livia said aloud, her voice cutting through the hall like a sharp blade. "A child so full of potential, reduced to nothing more than a plaything. Do you have any last words, child?" Elira lifted her head, her golden eyes filled with defiance. Despite the blood that dripped from her bruised lips, despite the searing pain that radiated from every joint in her body, she refused to bow. She had lost everything: her family, her title, her home, but her spirit, her will to survive, was unbroken. It was the last thing they had not taken from her, and she would hold on to it for as long as she could. Her voice was weak, strained, but it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. "You may have destroyed my house, but you will never destroy my spirit." Livia's laugh echoed again, high and mocking. "Your spirit? You have nothing left, girl. Nothing. And soon, you will be nothing." The nobles around the hall murmured in agreement, some with cruel smiles, others with indifferent expressions. To them, Elira was just another casualty of the grand game they played, a piece to be sacrificed in the name of power and control. There was no place for weakness in the Crystari Dominion. The strong ruled, and the weak were discarded like refuse. They had seen this countless times before: rising houses crushed under the weight of their ambition, their heirs crushed beneath the bootheels of the powerful. Yet, in that moment, when the weight of the judgment seemed too much to bear, something unexpected happened. A figure, uninvited and unnoticed, stepped forward from the shadows. His clothing was simple, unadorned, a stark contrast to the opulence of the highborns surrounding him. He was a human, one of the few from the far-flung colonies beyond the Dominion's reach, a wanderer who had found his way to the court of Varelia. His name was Riker Vance, a former soldier turned mercenary, his face hardened by the harshness of space and the scars of countless battles. Riker's gaze met Elira's, and for a fleeting moment, the chaos of the court seemed to still. He saw the girl kneeling before him, her dignity shattered but not lost, her eyes blazing with a fire that could not be quenched by the mockery of these nobles. His heart, long numb from years of fighting and surviving, stirred for the first time in a long while. In that brief silence, something shifted. Riker knew the look of someone who had been broken, but he also knew the look of someone who was still fighting to stand. Without a word, he strode forward, his heavy boots striking the floor with a solid thud. His presence was like a sudden storm, an unexpected gust of wind that shook the foundation of the chamber. The nobles who had laughed, who had gloated over Elira's fall, fell silent, their eyes now fixed on the lone human standing among them. "What is this?" Livia Tresh sneered. "A simple mercenary thinks he can challenge us? The Crystari Dominion does not answer to your kind." Riker didn't flinch. His eyes, cold and steady, never left Elira. "I don't care about your Dominion," he said, his voice low but firm, "but I care about her." He reached down and, with surprising tenderness, pulled Elira to her feet. The chains that bound her rattled, but they did not hold her back. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Elira stood tall though weak, her strength momentarily rekindled by Riker's unexpected act of kindness. The nobles stared in stunned silence as Elira's golden eyes met Riker's. In that moment, she saw him not as a stranger, but as something more, someone who saw her not as a symbol of disgrace, but as a person, someone who, against all odds, had helped her stand again. The warmth of his touch, the unwavering strength in his eyes, was a lifeline thrown into the stormy sea of her despair. Livia Tresh's face twisted in fury as she rose from her throne. "How dare you?" she shouted, her voice dripping with venom. "You will regret this, human." Riker didn't respond. He simply stood there, holding Elira's gaze, ready to face whatever consequences awaited him. And for the first time in years, Elira felt something stir within her hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her standing. Riker's hand tightened around Elira's, a symbol of defiance in a court that had long since given up on mercy or honor. The moment his fingers wrapped around her wrist, the very air in the chamber seemed to shift. Something ancient and primal awoke in the heart of Varelia. The nobles of the Crystari Dominion may have ruled with impunity, but here, in this one instant, one human and outsider, an alien in this land of glittering aristocracy, had become the storm that threatened to undo their delicate facade. Livia Tresh's eyes narrowed, her lips pressed into a tight, thin line. Her gaze flickered toward the Crystari lords who had witnessed Elira's degradation, her humiliation, and now, her small, yet defiant stand. There was a low murmur among the nobles, the collective realization that a single human had dared to challenge the order of the Dominion. They were all born of the same arrogance, one that demanded servitude from everyone, one that believed the universe itself bent to their will. But here, before them, stood a human who did not bend, who did not cower before their authority. "You will regret this." Livia's voice came again, this time colder, sharp like the bite of ice. She stepped down from her raised seat, her presence descending on the room like a storm cloud about to break. The other highborns tensed, unsure whether to intervene or simply watch the spectacle unfold. The Crystari were known for their ruthless politics, their quick dispatching of those who dared to defy them, but Riker's defiance was not to be measured in the usual terms of power. It was something different, something they couldn't quite place. Riker stood firm, his body squared, his gaze unyielding. "You may own this court, Livia, but you do not own her," he said, his voice booming in the stillness of the room. "You do not own any of us." The words echoed, carrying a weight that pushed against the polished walls of the court, against the centuries of tradition and brutality that had shaped the Dominion. Elira could feel the heat rising in her chest, the anger that had smoldered in her heart for so long now sparking into life. She had never been given a chance to fight back, never given the space to stand, let alone speak. But here, in the eyes of this human, she saw something she had lost, hope. And it surged within her, sending a jolt of strength through her trembling limbs. For a moment, there was silence. Livia stood still, her body rigid, her mind turning over the sudden disruption. But there was no fear in her eyes. She had lived her entire life in the belief that she was untouchable, that her wealth, her power, and her bloodline were all that was needed to ensure her place at the top. But the human before her did not flinch under her gaze. He did not bend to her will. Instead, he stood there, unwavering, as if daring her to make the next move. The silence was broken by the sound of Riker's voice once more. If you want her, if you want to break her like you have done to so many before her, then you'll have to go through me first. His eyes locked onto Livia, and in them, there was something that made the air grow thick with tension, a silent challenge, a declaration of war. Alyra stood there, feeling the rush of adrenaline coursing through her veins. The blood in her veins burned like fire. She could feel the hum of power beneath her skin, not the raw power of her people's technology or the manipulation of gravitons, but the raw, unyielding force of a human standing by her side when no one else would. The chains that bound her felt lighter, less significant, as if they were made of paper rather than metal. I've spent my life watching others break me, Alyra said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the trembling in her limbs. She looked up at Riker, and for the first time in what felt like years, she allowed herself to meet another's gaze without shame. But you're right. I don't belong to them. Livia's lips curled into a cold, bitter smile. You truly think you can defy us, human? A mercenary, a nameless wanderer, and a fallen noble girl? Her eyes flicked from Alyra to Riker, contemptuous, dismissive. You have no place here. None of you do. Riker's lips twisted into a grim smile. Then maybe it's time to make a new place. For both of us. The moment hung in the air, fragile as glass, but the pieces had already begun to shatter. Alyra felt something inside of her break free. The chains were still there, but now they felt less like a symbol of her captivity and more like a badge of her survival. She had endured. She had made it this far. And now, with a human standing by her side, someone who didn't care about her noble blood or her title, she was free in ways she had never imagined. And yet, in the midst of this fragile rebellion, there was the sound of heavy footsteps echoing from the back of the hall. A tall figure emerged from the shadows, a man in dark, weathered armor, his eyes cold and calculating. He was older, perhaps, but his presence commanded attention. He was a man of war, a man who had seen the depths of destruction and risen from it. His name was Oren Tezhar, and his house had fallen just as swiftly as Velker, though in different circumstances. He had no loyalty to the Crystari. He had no stake in the game of noble politics. But what he saw in Riker and Alyra, what they were doing here, was something that called to him. I think it's time someone else had a say in this matter. Oren's voice was deep, a rumbling echo that filled the room. You may have your titles and your power, Livia, but you don't own the stars. Not anymore. Livia's gaze shifted, her eyes narrowing as the reality of the situation began to set in. The power balance in this court was shifting, but whether she would stand for it was still in question. Her eyes locked onto Oren's, and for the first time in the history of the Crystari Dominion, there was hesitation in her movements. Chapter 2. The Flames of Resistance. Alyra felt a weight lift from her chest as Oren's presence filled the room like an electric storm, crackling with the promise of change. She had spent so many years trapped in the webs of court politics, torn between her loyalty to a family that no longer existed and the brutal demands of survival. But in that instant, standing with Riker and now with Oren, she felt the fires of rebellion stirred deep within her. The nobles of the Crystari Dominion, arrogant, powerful, and untouchable, had begun to feel the first tremors of their world shifting beneath them. But Livia Tresh, ever the snake in the grass, was not one to cower so easily. She stood tall, her head held high despite the flaring tension in the air. The room was electric, filled with anticipation, but she did not show fear. You think you can simply challenge the order of the Dominion? Livia's voice rang out, her eyes locking on each of them in turn. You may be an old warrior, Oren, but your age has made you weak. And you, she turned back to Riker, are nothing but a filthy mercenary. Riker smiled, his posture unwavering. Filthy mercenary or not. Livia, I've done things your house wouldn't dream of. Things you would never dare. Oren's grin was a sharp blade as he stepped forward, standing beside Riker, his stance one of silent support. And I've destroyed houses. Your house won't be the first I burn. Alira's breath quickened as she stood between them, her hands shaking but her spirit renewed. She could see the hesitation in Livia's eyes now, the crack in her confidence. The Crystari nobles, once untouchable, were beginning to see the cracks in their foundation, and Alira would make sure those cracks became fissures. This ends today, Alira said, her voice rising above the murmurs in the room. Not with you laughing at my fall, not with you tearing apart everything my family built, but with us standing together and fighting back. And for the first time in her life, Alira stood not as the broken noble girl of a fallen house, but as the leader of something much more powerful, an idea, a resistance. The Dominion might have laughed at her, but now they would tremble at the fire she would ignite. The room trembled with a low hum as Alira's words rang out, like the first rumblings of an earthquake that had been building for generations. She could feel it in her bones, in the way the nobles' eyes flickered from one another, exchanging glances filled with uncertainty. For the first time in years, the Crystari nobles were no longer in control of the narrative. They were no longer the ones who dictated who lived and who died. That power had slipped, silently and swiftly, into the hands of someone who had nothing to lose. Livia Tresh's sharp, venomous gaze turned to the figure of Oren Tezhar, standing with Riker, a mercenary and a fallen lord, both of whom had now become the first sparks of a rebellion that would spread like wildfire. Her eyes were narrowed, calculating, but she knew in her core that her ability to crush them with the weight of her status had diminished. The cracks in the Dominion's unyielding facade were growing, and Alira felt the power within her surge as she stared down the woman who had helped orchestrate the destruction of her family. Enough, Livia said, her voice a low growl. You think you can start a war with a few men and a broken girl? Do you truly believe that you can defeat the Dominion, the empire that has ruled the stars for centuries? Her words rang with the authority of someone who had never known defeat, but Alira could see the weakness beneath it, the fear that Livia was trying to hide. The silence in the hall deepened, the air thick with anticipation. The crowd, once laughing, now stood still, waiting to see how this dangerous game would unfold. I'm not here to start a war, Riker said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of countless battles fought across the galaxy. I'm here to stop one. Alira felt his words strike deep into her chest, pushing aside the lingering doubts that had clouded her mind. She had been born into a world of power, of privilege, and of politics, but what Riker and Oren were showing her was something else, a power born not of wealth or status, but of unity, of standing up when the world seemed to be pressing down upon you. It was a power that came from knowing that the fight you were about to enter wasn't just for survival, it was for something greater. And in that moment, Alira knew that she could never go back to the life she once had, to the life that had bound her in chains of her family's honor. The fight she was about to wage was not just her own. It was the fight of every fallen house, every shattered dream, every child whose future had been stolen by the craven nobles of the Crystari Dominion. Oren stepped forward, his armor glinting in the dim light of the chamber. Livia, you may have won battles, but you've forgotten what it takes to win a war. You've forgotten the one thing that could have kept the Dominion intact. You've forgotten the value of loyalty. Livia's eyes flashed with anger, but she remained silent, unwilling to allow her emotions to show in front of the assembly. But the cracks were visible now, like veins of lightning running through a clear sky. The nobles around the hall exchanged glances, their confidence faltering. There were whispers, murmurs of doubt spreading like fire through dry grass. The image of the once unbreakable Crystari Dominion was shattering before their eyes, and Alira felt her chest swell with a fierce, intoxicating pride. I never asked for your loyalty, Livia hissed, her face contorted with fury. I don't need it. You will, Oren replied coolly. Because when you have nothing left to control, when your wealth and your titles are reduced to ash, you will see what it means to stand alone. Alira watched as the tension in the hall reached its boiling point. She had never felt so alive, so powerful, and so certain of the path she was about to walk. The anger that had festered in her heart for years, the desire to reclaim her family's legacy, had never been clearer. She had spent too long in the shadows of others, living in fear of the power that held her down. But now, in this moment, she knew that she could stand tall, that she could lead the charge against the very system that had sought to break her. "I will not be your pawn any longer," Elira said, her voice carrying across the room, every word dripping with conviction. "House Velker is no more, but House Velker is not the only thing I carry. I carry the blood of 1,000 forgotten heroes, the legacy of those who fought for freedom, and I will not let it die quietly." The room was still, and then, as if responding to her words, the floor beneath their feet seemed to rumble. The air shifted. The Crystari nobles who had once laughed at her were now silent, their expressions unreadable, caught in the web of the challenge she had thrown before them. For the first time, they were unsure of themselves. And for the first time, Elira saw the faintest glimmer of fear in their eyes. Livia Tresh stood at the center of the dais, but even she could no longer mask the doubt that was creeping into her heart. Elira had not simply defied her, she had stripped away her illusion of control, and that was a weapon far more dangerous than any physical assault. The Crystari, so used to their unassailable rule, had been forced to reckon with a truth they could no longer deny. They were no longer invincible. "You may think you've won this moment," Livia spat, "but you are nothing. You are nothing without power. You are nothing without your titles, your houses, your armies." "We'll see about that," Riker said. "Because unlike you, Livia, we have something stronger than titles. We have something more powerful than gold or ships. We have the will to change the stars themselves." Elira stepped forward, standing beside Riker and Orin, her head held high. "And we'll start with you." The nobles watched as she took her place among them, not as a fallen noble, not as a victim, but as a force to be reckoned with. The battle for the future of the Crystari Dominion had begun, and Elira Vel was no longer its pawn, she was its leader, and the stars themselves would soon know her name. Chapter 3: The Rise of House Velker. In the weeks that followed the confrontation in the Varelian court, the galaxy itself seemed to tremble under the weight of the shift that was taking place. The Crystari Dominion, once a monolithic empire that had crushed entire worlds beneath its boothiel, now found itself on the brink of collapse. Word of the rebellion led by Elira Vel spread like wildfire across the stars, carried by those who had long since been oppressed by the Dominion's cruelty. It was not just the fall of House Velker that had ignited this fire, it was the idea that no house, no noble, no empire was untouchable. As Elira, Riker, and Orin formed a tenuous alliance with the remnants of the fallen houses, a new force began to coalesce in the shadows of the Dominion. Loyalists, mercenaries, and exiled noble families who had once fought for the Dominion now saw in Elira a symbol of hope, of defiance, and of the possibility of a new order. With every ship they captured, with every world they liberated from the Dominion's iron grip, their ranks grew, swelling with those who sought not just survival, but the reclamation of what had been stolen from them. Elira stood in the war room aboard the Resolute, a former Dominion warship now repurposed as their flagship, looking over the star maps that stretched across the holographic table before her. The road ahead was treacherous, filled with dangers that they had yet to fully comprehend. The Crystari would not surrender easily. They would fight to preserve their centuries-old reign. But Elira's heart burned with the certainty that victory was within their grasp, and she would stop at nothing to see it realized. "We have the momentum," Orin said, standing beside her, his rough hand pointing to the map. "We take the next system, and we'll have control over the key trade routes into the heart of Dominion space. From there, we strike." Riker, leaning against the wall with arms crossed, nodded. "This is it. We either push forward and finish this, or retreat and give them time to regroup. No more holding back." Elira's eyes met Riker's, and for the first time, she allowed herself to smile. "We're not retreating. We're taking everything." The next few weeks were a blur of calculations and strategies, of aligning forces and gathering allies. The rebellion, now growing in strength, had formed alliances with former enemies and emboldened the disillusioned remnants of the Crystari Dominion's outer colonies. Elira had quickly become the beacon of their hope, her very name invoking the possibility of an uprising that could rip through the fabric of the Dominion itself. Her once broken spirit, now reignited by the flames of rebellion, was the spark that set everything into motion. She had always been the heir to a great house, one that had been crushed beneath the weight of political schemes, but now she was something more. She was a symbol, a leader, and with the help of her allies, she had turned the tide. Riker and Oren were her staunchest supporters, and together, they formed the core of a new leadership, one that was driven not by the desire for power, but by the will to free the galaxy from the iron grasp of the Dominion. They had no illusions about the task ahead of them. This would not be an easy war. The Dominion's remaining forces were vast, and the Crystari were not known for their mercy. But Alyra had learned something in the weeks since the court incident. Sometimes, to build something new, you had to first tear down the old. The Crystari had built an empire on blood and fear, but it was a house of cards that would crumble the moment it was pushed. And push it they would. The first strike came swiftly. They had located a key Dominion supply station near the border of the Gorthos cluster, an outpost crucial to the Dominion's control over the sector. If they could take it, they would cut off a major supply line and deal a heavy blow to the Dominion's war efforts. Alyra, Oren, and Riker knew that this would be the moment that defined the rebellion. It was their first real test, and if they failed, they would lose everything. The battle was brutal, the chaos of starships clashing in the vacuum of space. The Resolute, now equipped with newly acquired weapons and technologies liberated from the Dominion's own armories, cut through the enemy defenses like a hot knife through butter. Alyra stood at the helm, her gaze locked on the battle unfolding outside the massive windows of the war room. The thrum of the battle outside matched the pulse of her own heart. Each explosion, each strike, a reminder of the stakes. "We're getting close," Oren said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Prepare for the boarding phase." Riker, his face bathed in the glow of the battle screens, grinned. They won't know what hit them. With a signal, the rebel forces launched their assault on the supply station, their boarding pods streaking through the vacuum toward the enemy vessel. As the pods collided with the hull, Riker led the charge with his team, cutting through the Dominion forces with brutal precision. Alyra followed close behind, her mind focused, her body moving as though it was instinctually part of the mission. She had trained for moments like this, though she had never imagined she would one day be leading this charge herself. The Dominion forces inside the station were overwhelmed, their morale shattered by the unexpected attack. Within hours, the supply station had fallen, its key facilities under rebel control. Alyra stood victorious, the feeling of triumph surging through her. She had done it, her first victory. The war for the galaxy had truly begun, and it would not be easy. But this was no longer about revenge for the past. It was about creating a future where those who had once been oppressed could finally breathe free. But victory came with a price. As the battle ended and the crew of the Resolute began to stabilize the station, a communications signal came through, a coded message from an unknown source. Alyra quickly decoded it, her eyes scanning the message with growing concern. The message was simple, but the weight it carried was immense. They know. Prepare for the final confrontation. The Crystari will strike back with everything they have. Alyra's stomach sank as she understood the full gravity of what had just been said. The Dominion was not going to let this rebellion go unpunished. They were about to bring the full force of their military might down upon her and everyone she had fought for. Chapter 4. The Final Stand. In the days that followed, the rebel forces scrambled to prepare for the inevitable retaliation. The victory at the supply station had been a blow to the Dominion, but it had also stirred the hornet's nest. Alyra, Riker, and Oren gathered in the war room, their minds focused on what was to come. The Dominion would come for them with everything: starships, armies, weapons of mass destruction. Alyra knew that this would be their defining moment. This was at the final confrontation. There would be no retreat. There would be no surrender. The Crystari had underestimated them once, and now they would face the consequences. "We can't win this war with just what we have," Riker said, his voice filled with urgency. "We need more. We need allies. We need to bring down the Crystari once and for all." Alyra nodded, her gaze determined. "Then we make a stand. We turn the galaxy against them. We show them that the people of this universe will no longer bow to their tyranny." Oren stepped forward, his grim face illuminated by the holographic projections of the battle map. "I know where we can get the firepower we need," he said. "There's a secret fleet of Dominion ships hidden in the Far Reach Nebula. If we can capture it, we'll have the strength to break the Crystari's hold on the galaxy. Elira's eyes lit up. Then it settled. We'll launch a full-scale assault on the Far-Reach Nebula. If we can get those ships, we'll have a chance to win this war. The preparation for the final assault was swift, the forces united in purpose and resolve. The fleet of the Resolute, bolstered by ships from allied factions and newly liberated forces, assembled in orbit, ready for the most daring strike yet. Elira stood on the bridge, her hands steady as she commanded the fleet, her mind razor-focused on the task at hand. She had come a long way from the broken girl who had been dragged before the Crystari court. She had risen from the ashes of her family's fall, and now she was the one leading the charge against the very forces that had once destroyed her. As they approached the Far-Reach Nebula, the tension in the air was palpable. The fleet was ready, their weapons primed, their shields up, but Elira knew that this would be the fight of their lives. The Crystari would not go down easily. They would throw everything they had at them. But they were ready. The people of the galaxy had finally found their voice, and with it, they would fight for their freedom. The battle was fierce, the nebula alive with explosions as the two forces clashed. But Elira's resolve never wavered. With every strike, with every explosion, she pushed forward. She fought not for herself, not for revenge, but for something greater. For the future of the galaxy. For the people who had been crushed beneath the weight of tyranny for far too long. In the end, it was a single-shot, a calculated, precise strike that destroyed the Crystari's flagship and crippled their command structure. The Dominion's forces faltered, their communications disrupted, their will broken. And in that moment, as the Crystari began to retreat, Elira knew that the galaxy had changed forever. The Crystari Dominion, once an empire that had ruled with an iron fist, had fallen. Elira stood on the bridge of the Resolute, staring out at the stars. The war was over, and victory was theirs. But the real battle had just begun. The galaxy was now free, but it was up to the people to rebuild it, to ensure that what had been broken would never fall into the hands of those who would seek to destroy it again. And for the first time in her life, Elira felt the weight of responsibility not as a burden, but as a promise to the people who had stood beside her, to the allies who had risked everything, and to the future of a galaxy now free to choose its own fate.